And now, lest we forget with Kelvin Gonzalez.
Hi, I'm Macdonald, and this is the fake news. I'm just kidding. I'm Kelvin Gonzalez, and for my Lest We Forget project, I will be explaining the details of comedian, writer, and actor Macdonald. Norm's dry, provocative, uncaring comedy has been hailed by many, like David Letterman, Conan O'Brien, Dave Chappelle, and Seth Meyers, to be one of, if not the best comedian of all time, and influencing many more such as Mark Norman, Shane Gillis, Sarah Silverman, Tom Green, Jim Brewer, and many more. My main source for this project will be based on a true story written by Norm Macdonald himself and published by the Random House Publishing Group in 2016. Because the memoir was written 5 years before his death, I feel it will help me cover most of his life, especially from his point of view. Norm's provocative, uncompromising reputation, along with his refusal to change his material for audiences, has made him obscure to larger audiences while still holding a cult following years after his biggest projects and death. Norm was born Norman Jean Macdonald on October 17, 1959, to two English teachers in Quebec City, Quebec, and raised in rural Ontario, Canada. Norm's extensive time around his elders in rural Canada hugely influenced his style of comedy, way of speech, and perspective. It was also on this farm that a family friend sexually abused Norm at 8 years old, causing a large lapse in memory for several years. This seemingly affected him the rest of his life, never speaking openly about it and becoming very reserved about his personal life. Shy but intelligent, Norm displayed incredible intelligence doing calculus at 9, graduating from his high school at 14, and enrolling at Carleton University at age 16 to pursue mathematics and philosophy. Norm later dropped out and enrolled into Algonquin College before dropping out there too. Aimless and looking for employment, Norm took a series of jobs in unskilled labor where his stand-up comedy started to develop.
I specialized in unskilled labor, and I was good at it. Skilled labor appealed to a different sort. It was for the thinking man. Men who like to use their heads as much as their bodies. I didn't like to use my head, but I loved unskilled manual labor. That kind of work let my mind alone. Let it be free. If my job was to shovel and shovel until 8 hours had passed, then my body worked on its own. It had no use for my mind. So my mind would take off to a world of imagination. And that's where stand-up comedy started.
Armed with the nonchalance of Dean Martin and a mysterious, deflective on-stage persona akin to Bob Hope, Norm began performing in comedy clubs around Ottawa in 1985, notably Yuck Yucks. It would be at Yuck Yucks that Norm would meet his future wife, Yuck Yucks waitress Connie Valancourt, who he married 3 years later in 1988 and had Dylan Macdonald in 1992, before later divorcing in 1999 to never marry again. Getting better and better at stand-up comedy and building up a name, Norm would make his network television debut on Letterman in 1990. It was also around this time that he had his first fight with cancer and took a year off comedy. After recovering, Norm was hired as a writer on The Dennis Miller Show, Roseanne, and eventually, SNL. Even though he was hired initially as a writer on SNL, Norm quickly became a cast member and gained notoriety for his Weekend Update segment amongst the few iconic sketches he was in.
If I am remembered, it will always be by the 4 years I spent at Saturday Night Live, and maybe even more than that, by the events surrounding my departure from that show. As long as SNL exists, then so do I. When people come to see me do stand-up, it is because somewhere in their memory I live on SNL, dressed as a young Burt Reynolds, insisting Alex Trebek refer to me as Turd Ferguson.
Norm's style and approach on Weekend Update was unique from his predecessors, in which he reveled in distaste from the audience, bombing on purpose, whether for his own amusement or if he simply liked the joke.
But Downey felt he should warn me that the type of comedy we were writing wasn't traditional, and I couldn't expect to get wall-to-wall laughs. This was avant-garde stuff. I didn't tell him at the time, but if not getting laughs was avant-garde, I'd been avant-garde week in and week out in stand-up clubs across the country.
It would also be on the Weekend Update segment where Norm would relentlessly and irreverently ridicule O.J. Simpson to the point where he was fired by network president Don Ohlmeyer, who was friends with O.J. After this point, Norm would choose to live in America for the rest of his life, although never getting full U.S. citizenship, to focus on his performing career in New York or Hollywood, returning to Canada on one occasion to film 1998's Dirty Work.
It was such fun to be back in Canada, my true home strong and free. I was born in the great white north, and I remain to this day a Canadian citizen, and will till the day I die. And I'll tell you why. Canada is the country that shaped me, that taught me right from wrong, that turned me from a boy to a man. Also, that American citizenship test is way, way too hard.
It was also at SNL where Norm would become a gambling addict after winning $100,000 in Atlantic City at a craps table. It would become this addiction in which he would often spend entire sums of paychecks from SNL. Norm spent a large portion of his life gambling, often staying up long nights for multiple days, sneaking off SNL, and becoming broke 3 times, claiming he has quit multiple times, but relapsing many more. Norm never truly quit gambling, although claiming many times he has. He initially began gambling to cope with his dissatisfaction with the materialism that fame brought, but slowly instead became to cope with his race against death.
It is a particular moment, a magic moment, that occurs after the placing of a bet and before the result of that bet. It is after the red dice are thrown, but before they lie still on the green felt where they fall. It is when the dice are in the air, and as long as they are there, time stops. As long as the red dice are in the air, the gambler has hope. And hope is a wonderful thing to be addicted to.
It would be after SNL that Norm would fade into obscurity, but hold a cult following, starring in a few movies and TV shows, making small appearances in many more, and focusing heavily on his ever-irreverent stand-up, with one incident getting him kicked out of the state of Iowa, much to the delight of his fans. It would be later in life he would gain a slightly larger cult following after his acclaimed stand-up specials, podcasts, and late-night appearances. Norm would die on September 14th, 2021, from a cancer diagnosis he had kept secret since 2013. So how should we remember Norm Macdonald? I think we should remember Norm Macdonald as one of the funniest people to ever walk the planet. His contributions through writings, TV appearances, movies, radio, and podcast still hold up today as distinct, fearless, hilarious, and impossible to replicate. In a world full of comedians who try to stand out with awkward or provocative humor, it is important to know just who perfected it. His unique comedy voice will continue to echo and influence comics and comedians to come, not just in Canada or the US, but throughout the world as well. Whether it be behind the Weekend Update desk or some offhanded reference to one of his quips, Norm's impact on the comedy world cannot be denied. And that's the way it is, folks. Good night, and good luck.